Mero ellas.
No permitiremos que en nuestras tierras comunales se construyan parques eólicos.
Los de parque eólico dicen que vienen y traen una buena condición, pero no es cierto. Campesinos, pescadores, no está saliendo a nuestro provecho.
Esta es una reunión del Consejo Nacional Indígena del Regionalismo de Oaxaca. Estamos enfrentando a las empresas transnacionales que vienen con la finalidad de invertir en los proyectos eólicos y también las empresas mineras y algunas otras empresas que también tienen como finalidad apropiarse de nuestros bienes naturales.
Han venido instalándose más empresas, más parques eólicos, que hasta la fecha tenemos 25 parques, 1.915 aerogeneradores, cerca de 2.000 megawatts de energía que se están produciendo cada hora. Bueno, esto lo que ha implicado es despojo del territorio, es conflictividad en las comunidades, es agresión a las comunidades, es impactos en la agricultura, contaminación, muerte de aves, de murciélagos, ruptura del tejido social, muchísimos problemas, ¿no?, que ha venido ocasionando, y que finalmente esa promesa que viene ofertando el gobierno y las empresas, que eso es desarrollo y empleo, pues no existe, ¿no? O sea, realmente eso no existe, eso es un mito genial.
Ustedes vienen a quitarnos nuestra forma de vida. Dicen, va a haber desarrollo para la nación del Istmo y de Tehuantepec. Un desarrollo desde el punto de vista de ustedes. Yo no sé qué tipo de desarrollo sea el que ustedes quieren, pero el desarrollo que nosotros queremos es poder despertar tranquilamente en las mañanas, es poder tener comida para nuestros hijos, es poder tomar nuestro chocolate, es poder comer nuestro coco, nuestro queso fresco, nuestro camarón, nuestro pescado.
El beneficio que se tiene es producir energía eléctrica mediante un proceso de limpio, digamos, con energía limpia, ya que no tenemos quema de combustibles en esta producción. Con esto estamos alrededor de 1.200.000 toneladas de dióxido de carbono que se dejan de liberar y evitamos el efecto invernadero, ¿no?
Cuando llegan los parques eólicos, empiezan a talar el bosque, empiezan a talar la selva. Entonces ahí es donde nos damos cuenta de que no era cierto, no es cierto que traen los proyectos para mitigar el calentamiento global, puesto que los bosques, las selvas, generan oxígeno. Se están montando de la enfermedad que han provocado las mismas empresas a la madre tierra para poder despojar a los pueblos originarios de los bosques, de las selvas, del territorio, ahora del aire, que cada elemento de la madre naturaleza lo están comercializando. Entonces, los parques eólicos para nosotros no es un proyecto de vida, ni de la madre tierra ni de nosotros, porque es un proyecto que está matando, primero, la madre tierra, segundo, la flora, la fauna, que estamos como habitantes del territorio e hijos de la madre tierra, también nos está trayendo consecuencias
Vamos a hablar un poco de las afectaciones, ¿no? De los aerogeneradores que ya están plantados aquí en el istmo de Tehuantepec. Pues anteriormente, antes de que llegaran los proyectos eólicos, todas las áreas verdes se veía bien bonito, había árboles, había siembran en todos los terrenos, pero ahora pues ya se ve diferente, ya no hay áreas verdes, ya vemos puros aerogeneradores sembrados en los terrenos, ya no hay cultivos, los campesinos pues ya no entran en sus parcelas, ellos rentaron sus tierras y ya no es fácil que ellos entren como entraban antes, tienen que pedir permiso a las empresas, ya no pueden sembrar como lo venían haciendo antes, porque hay peligro de que algunos de los aerogeneradores se vayan a quemar cuando ellos estén trabajando en terrenos. Cuando eso sucede, todo un terreno prácticamente se llena de aceite, todo lo que derrama el aerogenerador cuando se quema y afecta todos los terrenos que están alrededor. Los aerogeneradores, cuando ellos lo instalan, son toneladas de varillas lo que meten en el interior de la tierra, toneladas de varilla, toneladas de cemento, claro que tapan el cauce del manto freático que tenemos aquí en la tierra y cambian el curso del agua. Entonces, los pozos están secándose, los lugares que están instalados los parques eólicos, hay menos lluvia, hay más sequía. Aquí en el istmo de Tehuantepec, por ejemplo, aquí en Santa María Xadani, la mayoría de la gente son pescadores y jornaleros que cortan leñas para su familia, para su casa. Se instalaron los aerogeneradores cerca de Playa Vicente, hay muchos pescadores también. Ahora pues ya no hay producto, ahuyenta los peces con la vibración de los aerogeneradores, con esa luz intermitente que despiden todas las noches.
Como pueblos originarios, estamos contribuyendo a la sanación de nuestra madre tierra, al conservar bosques, a conservar agua, a conservar una forma de vida comunitaria, colectiva, pensando en la madre tierra y los humanos que habitamos en ella, y no solamente humanos, sino que la vida de la madre tierra, la flora, la fauna y el ambiente, ¿no? Entonces, contra esta vida nos quieren imponer una vida individual y una vida sin vida, una muerte, pues, que traen los megaproyectos. Para defender la soberanía de este país llamado México, los que hemos ido en primera fila, aunque sea como carne de cañón, nos han utilizado, fuimos los indígenas. Desde la independencia de México, la Revolución Mexicana, nosotros fuimos en primera fila. Entonces, para defender nuestro territorio, vamos a ir en primera fila también, y no vamos a permitir que un puñado de empresarios nos despojen nuestro territorio, porque sabemos de que el discurso que están utilizando para imponer los parques eólicos
Buenas tardes. ¿Sí me escuchan?
Sí.
Gracias por acompañarnos
Good
en esta primera
evening.
conferencia virtual
Greetings
de la
from the
revista
Sexta Grietas del Norte
Network.
Network. The central theme of this event is to make known the current situation of the original peoples of Mexico to the people of the United States. First, I want to briefly share with you who we are as the Sexta Grietas Norte Network.
Cumpliría 38 años, de no ser porque su vida fue arrebatada el 20 de febrero del año pasado. Su vida y también su muerte estuvieron vinculadas al movimiento opositor a la termoeléctrica de Oaxaca y el proyecto integral Morelos, cuyo gasoducto pasa por el territorio de Amilcingo, de donde Samir era originario. Su asesinato queda como símbolo de la represión de la lucha en contra de los megaproyectos. Con esta presentación nos sumamos a la acción global contra los megaproyectos, convocada por redes de resistencias y
We want to
rebeldías,
welcome you and
colectivos
introduce you
e
to
individuos
Samid and
adherentes a
the
los
work
ejes
of
de
the CNI.
recuperación
With
de la
this
selva
work, we
lacandona,
introduce
en
you
homenaje a Samir
some of the
y
works going
denunciando
on
la
against the
proliferación de
hydroelectric
proyectos de guardia.
programs and
En nuestra conferencia el día de hoy
against
contaremos
other
con la participación de Irma,
destructions of death
compañera
in
de
honor
grietas,
of Samir,
que
who was
tomará unos
killed.
minutos para dar la palabra colectiva de
In
nuestra red.
today's presentation, we
Enseguida
will
tendremos
count
la palabra
with
de dos
the
compañeros del
participation
Congreso
of
Nacional
Imwat, who
Indígena,
will
conocido como
be
CNI,
presenting the word of
Bettina
Grietas
Cruz,
Sectas del
concejala del
Norte. After
Consejo
her, we will
Indígena de Gobierno
be
del
having
mismo
the word
CNI,
of
y
the
Carlos
National
González,
Indigenous
miembro de
Congress,
la
known
Comisión
as the
Nacional.
CNI.
Ellos
Both Bettina
compartirán con
Cruz,
nosotros
a
cuestiones relacionadas con
councilor
qué es el
member
Congreso
of
Nacional
the
Indígena,
CNI,
cómo luchan y cómo
as
se
well as
organizan sus
Carlos
comunidades,
Gonzalez. They
cómo la
will share with
pandemia ha
us
afectado a las comunidades
issues
indígenas
related
en
to the
México y al
CNI
mismo tiempo
and what are
las
some of
ruedas del
the issues they're
neoliberalismo no se ha
addressing, how
detenido
the
y el gobierno
pandemic
mexicano sigue
has been
avanzando con
affecting
proyectos
indigenous peoples
destructivos
in
para las
Mexico,
comunidades que
and
se
how at the
encuentran
same time the
vulnerables.
wheels of
Además,
neoliberalism
nos
have
platicarán de cuál
not
es la
detained
perspectiva
itself
del
and
CNI del nuevo acuerdo comercial
continues to
impuesto por
destroy
la administración de
the
Trump a México y
communities
a
in which
Canadá,
these
el
projects
T-MEC.
are
Cada
located.
uno de ellos tendrá una intervención de 25 minutos y
This
regresará
is
por 10 más
in part a
para una
continuation
intervención
of
final
the
en conjunto.
treaties between Mexico
Para
and
finalizar,
Canada, a
tendremos una
new
sesión de 30
T-MEC,
minutos de
and
preguntas y
each one will
respuestas,
have 25
moderada por
minutes in their
Mario, otro miembro de
presentation,
nuestra red.
and then a
Sabemos que es
30-minute
ambicioso
Q&A
tratar de resumir
session
en 2 horas estos temas
moderated
tan
by
amplios
Mario, another member of
y además
our
identificar la
network.
relevancia de las luchas del Congreso Nacional Indígena
We
y
know
del
it is difficult
zapatismo,
to
la
resume
lucha
all
en
these
los Estados
difficult
Unidos.
and broad
Es por eso que
themes
les
in 2
proponemos
hours,
que
as
esta
well
sea la
as
primera
relaying
de
the
una serie de
struggle of the
conferencias
CNI
para
and the
seguir ahondando en estos
Zapatistas to
temas.
our struggles
Empezamos
in
pues con la
the
palabra
United
de la
States. That's
compañera
why we
Ima,
propose that
activista
this be the
fronteriza
first of
y una de
many
las fundadoras de nuestra red
webinars
Secta Grietas
speaking,
del
sharing
Norte.
this word to
Adelante,
people
compa
in the United
Ima.
States. We begin first with
Buenas
the
noches a todos y a
word of
todas.
Imwat
Reciban
on
un
behalf of
saludo de la
Grietas.
red Sexta Grietas del Norte. El tema
Good evening
central
to
de este
everyone.
evento es dar a conocer la
Greetings
situación
from
actual
Sexta
de los
Grietas del
pueblos
Norte Network.
originarios de México a la gente en los Estados Unidos.
The central theme of this event is to
Primero
make
quiero
known the current
compartir
situation of the
brevemente
original
quiénes somos
peoples of
nosotras,
Mexico to the
nosotros,
people
nosotras,
in the United
quienes
States.
conformamos la red Sexta Grietas del Norte.
First, I want to
Nuestro
briefly
nombre,
share who
la
we
secta,
are,
se refiere a
we
la
who
secta
make
de
up the Sexta
creación de
Grietas
los
del Norte
zapatistas
Network.
en el 2006.
Our name,
Grietas
Sexta,
se refiere a romper los muros que nos dividen
which is Spanish
para
for sixth,
conquistar y controlar.
refers to the Sixth
Desde
Declaration of
Estados
the
Unidos
Zapatistas in
luchamos para derribar
2006.
estos muros.
Grietas is Spanish for
Actualmente
cracks and
nuestra red
refers
se
to breaking
formó
down the
en
walls that
respuesta
divide
a la
us in
campaña
order
de
to
Desert
conquer and
ADN,
control us. From the
los muros
United
del
States, we
capital,
fight to
las
tear
grietas
down
de la
those walls.
izquierda. En ese
Currently,
encuentro
our
nos
network was formed in
comprometimos a traer
response to
café
the
zapatista
EZLN
al
campaign,
norte del muro
the
para
walls of
ayudar a los
capital,
hermanos
the cracks of
migrantes
the
y
left.
refugiados.
At
De
that
allí
meeting,
nació nuestra
we promised to
organización
bring
colectiva
Zapatista
y la
coffee to the
necesidad
north
de
of the
crear
wall to help
una red
migrant
más
and refugee
concreta de
relatives.
lucha y acompañamiento
From
con los
there,
compas del
our collective
CNI,
organization was
CIG y
born,
la
and the need to
ZLN.
create more concrete network
Desde ese comienzo
in
ya tenemos
struggle
4 años
and
trabajando con el
accompaniment with the
Congreso Nacional
compas of the
Indígena
EZLN
y a la
and
vez
the
conociéndonos
CNI-CIG.
poco a poco a nosotras y a nosotros
Since that
mismos.
beginning, we
Desde
now have 4 years
California a
working
Nueva
with the
York,
National Indigenous
hemos
Congress,
trabajado para que los
and at the
acuerdos
same
que
time
nos
getting to know
gobiernan
each other
sean
little by little,
horizontales y democráticos,
from
basados en la
California
igualdad
to
y
New
el
York.
respeto mutuo.
We have
Al
worked so
fin,
that
hemos
the
llegado al punto
agreements
en
that
que
govern
estamos
us are
listos para abrir
horizontal
las
and
puertas
democratic,
a los que
based
quieran
on
participar con
equality and
nosotros,
mutual
sean
respect.
organizaciones o
We have
individuos.
finally reached the
Aquí
point
les
where
quiero
we are ready to
compartir
open
un
the door
poco
to
de
those who would
nuestra
like to
misión colectiva.
participate with us, be they
Sexta Grietas del
organizations
Norte es una
or
red de
individuals.
organizaciones, individuos
Here, I want to
autónomos
share
de
the
resistencias
mission
y
of our
rebeldías que
network.
construyen autoorganización colectiva y lucha
Sexta
anticapitalista
Grietas del
contra las
Norte is a
estructuras
network of
jerárquicas del
autonomous
poder estatal
organizations and
y la
individuals,
civilización
of
capitalista de
resistances and
muerte.
rebellions that
Estamos
build collective
comprometidos y comprometidas con
self-organization
la
and
lucha por la
anti-capitalist
defensa y la
struggle
formación de
against
una
the
vida digna,
hierarchical structures
lo
of
que
state
incluye
power and
resistir
the
las
capitalist
opresivas
civilization of
jerarquías
death.
raciales y patriarcales
We are
y
committed
actuar
to the
fuera del
fight for the
sistema
defense
establecido
and the
de partidos
formation of a
políticos.
dignified life,
Nuestros
which includes
objetivos son
resisting the oppressive racial and patriarchal hierarchies, and acting outside the established system of political parties. Our objectives are to mutually support our struggles and solidarity with our compañeros from the Zapatista Army of National Liberation and the National Indigenous Congress, the Indigenous Governing Council, and the Sixth in Mexico and everywhere. We want to build a broad front of autonomous and community struggles in the United States. We join with all the peoples who struggle to create and preserve dignified and sustainable ways of life. especially the indigenous peoples who struggle to preserve their lives, history, identity, their ancestral lands, and to protect Mother Earth. Many people already know the Zapatista Army of National Liberation, which also participates in the National Indigenous Congress, CNI. But the people of the United States have much to learn about the multitude of communities fighting in the National Indigenous Congress, the CNI. The CNI is a grassroots organization that has nothing to do with the Mexican Congress. The CNI communities, like the Native communities in North America, defend their territory, their culture, and their future. Their struggles in both countries are our teachers and inspiration in the protection of Mother Earth. They are communities that promote traditional, sustainable, organic, and fair agriculture. An agriculture opposed to industrial crops that are polluted and polluting, opposed to the genetic engineering Monsantos of the world. People in the United States live in an industrialized and individualistic society, and we have much to learn from our original communities of their way of living, being, and seeing, and respecting the community, the world, and nature. This is something that in the North we are losing and we must recover. There is also much to learn from their political ways, where deep dialogue replaces the rigged vote. Communities where the one who rules by obeying. The resistance of the National Indigenous Congress is a call for us to wake up. We cannot continue to ignore that the life we enjoy in the United States is based on the exploitation and plunder of the peoples of the South. For this reason, from the global North, from the United States, we stand in solidarity with the CNI and the Zapatista movement, not only out of solidarity, but because our struggle is the same. To resist multinational capitalism, our struggle also has to be multinational. Their struggle is our struggle. If their resistance succeeds, we all win. If their rebellion is defeated, we all lose, including our Mother Earth. In the United States, as in Mexico, we suffer and fight against the same things: the pandemic, state police repression, mega projects, and the commercialization and domination of everyday life by transnational corporations. We are now forced to confront the coronavirus pandemic. The governments manipulate the numbers but cannot hide the tragedy. They cannot deny how neoliberalism systematically destroyed the public health systems that could protect us today. The so-called governments of Mexico and the United States knew of the pandemic and were unable to prepare us against the danger. They could not, because the owners of capital ordered that nothing be done. The so-called governments ignored the danger, hoping that with a little chlorine water, with prayers, and with goodwill, the COVID would go away. Stubborn as they are, the presidents of Mexico and the United States refused to even wear face masks. Both in Mexico and the United States, the worst part is carried by poor people. They are the people of color, the native peoples, women, and workers forced to work because they are supposedly essential or because they cannot stay home without dying of hunger. Various Native communities in Mexico and the United States were much more responsible to their people than the national governments. The Zapatista communities in Chiapas and the Lakota people in South Dakota, for example, closed to avoid contagion. They also strengthened their medical systems. In both Mexico and the United States, repression has become more complex and more brutal. We are attacked by police of all kinds, local and federal, immigration and National Guard, armies, and the Navy. But we are also attacked by armed groups that are supposedly outside the state. Organized crime in Mexico or white supremacist militias in the United States. They get together and coordinate with police and armies to hit us harder. There are also patriarchal, macho, and murderous groups. They harass women, especially from the indigenous peoples and communities of color. They are rapists with impunity. They are femicidal. Despite this, in both countries, we fight against exploitation and dispossession, and we look for another way of doing politics, opposed to the rotten and sold-out parties. The governments of Mexico and the United States have profound differences, but both despise the indigenous peoples by continuing to push through, despite the pandemic, their mega projects of death. They are great works created by and for the benefit of multinational capitalist corporations. They are mining, oil, tourism, energy projects, anti-immigrant walls, and monoculture plantations. The capitalist hydra has a new head, the so-called T-MEC, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA. This new trade agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico puts even more chains on the peoples. It forces the Mexican government to become its border police against Latin American migrants. They sell the agriculture and creativity of the people so that they increase the power, capital, and profits of capitalist corporations. Let's not fool ourselves. The profits from all these projects will not serve to improve the living, working, educational, or health conditions of our peoples. Quite the contrary, they will only increase the strength of the corporations and therefore the exploitation and dispossession that we suffer. When the Zapatistas announced that they were closing their communities to defend themselves from the coronavirus, they also made a call. Don't forget the struggles, they told us, and we will not forget them. Perhaps the most important struggle is learning to work together at all levels, between individuals and organizations, between our networks and coalitions, and between movements in various countries. This conference is like a mirror to see ourselves in the United States, an interactive mirror where both sides interact with each other. The Zapatistas inspire the resistance of the peoples in the United States. The movement in the United States for Black lives and against police brutality is replicated in the cities of Mexico. It is like a dance where the movements on one side invite you to move to the other side of the mirror. Let us continue to expand the resistance and rebellion. Let us fight and dance together. Let us learn from the wisdom of our compañeras and compañeros in the National Indigenous Congress. And together, let us destroy the walls of exploitation, dispossession, repression, and contempt. Thank you very much for your attention.
Ahora la compañera Bettina Cruz nos compartirá su palabra.
Thank you so much, Imwat, for bringing the collective word of the collectives and individuals.
En la región del Istmo de Tehuantepec. Es licenciada en
Now
Ingeniería
Bettina Cruz will share her word. Bettina is originary from Oaxaca, from Juchitán, from the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. She has a degree in agricultural engineering and a PhD in territorial planning and regional development. The compañera is a defender of land and human rights and is part of the Assembly of Indigenous People of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in defense of land and territory. Since 2007, this group of peoples has been in resistance against mega projects erected in the region. First wind energy, and now the Trans-Isthmic Corridor is added, which have had strong harmful impacts on land and the land and its inhabitants. Her group is part of the National Indigenous Congress. When the Indigenous Governing Council was formed in 2017 to participate in the presidential elections with its spokesperson Marichui, Bettina was chosen by her community to be its concejala, an appointment she has to date. The concejala Bettina realizes that in her region, the communities have been seriously hit by COVID and do not count on the health and medical resources to care for the residents who have had to organize themselves to get out of the pandemic as best as possible. We welcome our compañera Bettina Cruz.
Good afternoon to everyone, and many thanks for inviting me, for being here, everyone who's listening. and to the compas who are accompanying this transmission and all of the work that's happening here in this forum. According to the questions they sent us, they asked us to speak about what the CNI is, how we organize, how we struggle, what our struggle is. And I think that there's some information there that it's been talked about a bit. However, it's important to emphasize that the CNI is born as a space of encounter of the indigenous peoples of Mexico, because a moment came in the country where indigenous peoples weren't even talked about. And it was until in 1994 with the Zapatista uprising when I think that it became more visible, the existence of the indigenous peoples that the government and the system had made invisible, that we didn't exist, that we weren't here, in order to make it easier to dispossess us. And so in 1996, there was a call by the Zapatista people to create the National Indigenous Congress with the majority of the peoples, the indigenous peoples of this country. They decided to create a space to reflect, to be in solidarity. However, throughout this time, with the CNI, things changed, and we saw that it wasn't enough just to talk about what hurts us. It's not enough to just put out a communique that we're here. Rather, it's important to defend ourselves, to struggle for our lives. In this moment, when capitalism is so savage and it is making itself more profound in dispossession and is taking these global forms with these free trade agreements, it deepens, such as the US, Mexico, Canada agreement. So the indigenous peoples are in the CNI as a space where we can now, in this moment, following 2016, to also, when also the proposal was put forward to coordinate, to do something more, and some more actions that question the system, the capitalist system that is so patriarchal, that in 2017, we selected our compañera Marichui as our spokeswoman to put to question this system. And what was realized above all was the ability to make the word arrive and make it more visible to other people in the country. To people who identify as indigenous and to other people who don't. It's important that this struggle that we're doing, that is for life, is for everybody. And from that point on, then the networks of resistance are formed, and we've been working. The CIG, the Indigenous Governing Council, is created, and then what's put forward is that this will be the way forward to govern that we need in this country, against this system, this electoral system that just simulates democracy. That it's only for those from above. It's only for those who decide, who have economic and political power in this country. So rather, here we would actually be able to have people name their own representatives and to work about what on things that they need, that they want, what their own vision of the world and life is, in order to get to the flowering of the peoples. And so then the struggle, well, the struggle has to be collective. We emphasize that. Without those, some from above go down below and take advantage of the struggle. as always happens with many organizations. So the CNI, that's our space of the indigenous peoples, and now it is putting forward that it's not just the indigenous peoples, that we have to have this struggle. It's not of now, it's been this way for a while, but it's also about walking together in a way where we can coordinate and unite with other struggles that we have in the country for a dignified life, for justice. And so then what's being tried out is that the CNI and the CIG try to function like as a space where we can talk about and take up this coordination and join up to do this struggle for society that's much more just. It's more inclusive. It includes ourselves, where we ourselves can decide the way that we want to live without having it imposed by those who are coming on behalf of capitalism. That would be the first, my first answer to the first question. So also then, how has this pandemic affected our communities? We're talking about here the communities of the CNI, and I think that even communities that aren't of the CNI, indigenous communities that are excluded and that are abandoned by the system, it's very difficult. It's very difficult because in the first part, those of us in the communities, we don't really believe in this sickness, in this illness. Why? Well, because the things that were being said, like in the cities in the center of the country, they were talking about all kinds of things. They were talking about, like, what's the illness like? But then we didn't have it. We didn't have it where we were, maybe because the climate was different. Maybe because not a lot of people from the outside come. It could be for different things, because we're isolated, etc. There's so many things. So it wasn't the same way that we were affected in the ways that we saw in the urban areas throughout the country. There's a clear difference of how the country, or how the entire country doesn't function in this way, but the system tries that we all be the same. And so then what happened is that a lot of people didn't think about this illness, that it existed. And so people continue their lives. However, about a little bit more than a month ago, here, particularly where I live in Juchitán, we started to see a lot of deaths. We started to see that we were confronting that there isn't any money. Why? Because we got closed off. They shut down the possibility people could continue working and have money, have the possibility that they would truly be informed about what this illness was about, to be able to bring, for example, to talk about what was the necessary measures so that the contagion wouldn't take place. Instead, what was just said is that people should just stay at home and close up spaces. And people, well, they didn't understand it. But above all, many stopped working. Our parties were suspended, our traditional yearly celebrations were suspended, all of the rituals that we do that are so part of our identities and our customs and even our economy. And so then now we see many women who see, for example, with embroidery, with clothing, who weren't able to work, who weren't able to deliver their products, people who weren't able to make food or sell it. There were people who were working throughout the entire professions that we have here all around. Cultural works that weren't able to be done. And so then we got to this point where the pandemic is coming to our community, and it finds us, well, without money, without resources, without economic resources, and also without information, without good information, without hospitals. Even though they say that supposedly here in the Isthmus and here in Juchitán there is a COVID hospital, in the general hospital was contaminated, and the great majority of people, 90% of the people who were in the hospital got infected by COVID. There was with no service, no medicines. People weren't able to buy their own medicines, and then the medicines that could supposedly give you like successful possibilities on this pandemic, well, we couldn't find them. And that we see that here, which is supposedly a city. Juchitán is about 150,000 inhabitants, and we see it here in Juchitán, in the communities that are the smallest, that are around Juchitán. It's worse. The situation there is worse. People are dying without even knowing why they're dying. They don't understand why this is happening. They just know that this illness exists. There aren't any measures, any medicines, the hospitals. And in addition, there's another thing, that all of the people who end up dying in the hospitals, there's an agreement among hospitals, between the hospitals and the funeral businesses. They say that they just tell people that people are dying through COVID, and so then the funeral services are talking about that they, they have all of these costs that they have to, even if people die of COVID, people have to buy a cremation, they have to buy the funeral service, they have to buy everything, and so then the situation is really, really difficult, really complicated, and there has been a lot of death here. We've tried to, like with the support of you all, to bring forward, to bring out some medicines, but it's just so minimal. And then there's been some people who have organized also with their families with us, and so we've also tried to do alternative medicines with teas, but really like that also needs time, and right now it barely did it. And so then they're waiting for the time so that they can be ready, so that people can drink it and share it in the communities, and create promotoras of health, because at this moment we really can't do anything together. We can't get together because of the risk of ourselves getting ill and to make others ill. So the situation is very complicated, it's very difficult, and well, this government, well, it hasn't done anything. It hasn't done anything for the people. The people are dying. The people have to look after themselves. And we're truly here, like, if I were Catholic, it's in hands of God. Like, well, however, what has continued is the theme of the mega projects. Here, we know that the interoceanic corridor of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec is a mega project with the principal, one of the principal projects of this government, just as of the train of the peninsula of the Yucatan and these other projects that are going to come together. They're not isolated projects. They are projects that articulate together in order to control this area and to exploit it, to geopolitically control the southeastern part of Mexico and to exploit the commonwealth that we here conserve. And so in this region, there's petroleum in the majority part of Mexico, is found here in their area. This new administration of the fourth transformation is reconsidering this area here in this region. It's in the northern part, in Veracruz and Tabasco. That's where the petroleum is, and the big petrochemical centers, the Campeche platform, the petroleum platforms of Campeche. Here in the zone of the Istmo of Tehuantepec in the part of Oaxaca, we also have the electric energy because of wind energy, about 3,000 megawatts per hour. And also in Chiapas, there's electrical projects. All of that is found in this region. And also in this region, there's a great part of the water that exists for the nation. There's about 40% of the water can still be found here in the isthmus, in this part of the southeast. We also have the jungles that are probably the last ones of the country that are still preserved, the Chimalapas. And so here we have these great elements, these natural elements, cultural elements. We also have in this zone a great number of native peoples in Mexico that many have become impoverished by this capitalist neoliberal system of free trade. And so it's a great number of manual labor. And so then the person that is leading up this Trans-Isthmic corridor, it's Lopez Obrador. When he talks about this corridor, he talks about it not just being a corridor to transport, but it's also one to produce and will make possible to be able to extract the richness of the region using a large quantity of manual labor. And so then that has to do then with the Trans-Isthmic corridor. That's one of these enormous development projects of this administration, like with the Maya train, which I don't like calling the Maya train. It's in the Yucatan Peninsula, and they are all joined up, like for example, through some ways. This is all connected to the T-MEC, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, and with the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. Because this free trade agreement, it's not new. This is a free trade agreement, an old one that has many additions that have been put in there in order to continue to dominate and control the country. And so right now, for example, with that agreement, there are elements that talk to us about how many of the points that they've added, for example, there's a clause there that says any one of those countries that are part of this agreement have to let the others know when it has something to do, whenever it wants to wants to engage in free trade with another country. So there it talks specifically about China, because now there is a geopolitical dispute at this moment that has to do with the economy with this country, with the United States directly with China. And so, for example, the Trans-Isthmic corridor is a space that the United States is going to control. The United States is going to control migration, but of people who are impoverished in Central America who want to go to the United States. They're going to be detained in the Istmus of Tehuantepec with this mega project that has 10 industrial parks where they can detain the migrants so that they can sell their manual labor cheap. Another one of these clauses also, and it talks about this theme of automobiles. Before, in NAFTA, it said that 62% of automobiles could be or had to be from the region, and now it's deepened. It says 75%. I think that this is directly going to China, Korea, which are these countries that these companies, these automotive companies imported parts, automobile parts in order to use them. And now it's not going to be possible. All of this is going to have to be purchased from who else? Mexico. No, Mexico doesn't produce it. In accordance to this new free trade agreement, Mexico doesn't produce these parts, they have to be purchased from Canada or the United States. And so then this is another element in order to block the commerce of these countries from doing business with Mexico, particularly with China. And also this theme of, well, of manual labor. They talk about how in the automobile industry also, that an automobile has to have 40 to 45% of the automobile has to be produced in one of those three countries. Within the three countries, that 40 to 45% of production has to take place, and with workers that earn at least $16 an hour. Wow, $16 an hour. In Mexico, that's not even like a day's rate. So directly, it has to say that what it means is that this is going to finally end up going to be and benefit this, the country in the north, the countries in the north. And so one of the things that is so scary is this gasoduct plants, because also in the interoceanic corridor, that there is a pipe that comes from Veracruz to here, to Salina Cruz, to Central America, to Escuintla, Guatemala, and then south, I imagine. This gasoduct is going to prolong, is going to make even longer a gasoduct that barely started to work in 2019. That was Texas Tuxpan. And what this pipeline brings is natural gas that is exploited in Texas, this gas pipeline, through the United States, and then is sold over to the United States for electricity in order to produce energy. And that now they're now talking about creating another gas pipeline that comes so that it doesn't come to Tuxpan. In Tuxpan, there are other gas pipelines that go like to Tula, for example, to Totonilco, for I think. And there's the gas pipeline that they are trying to go all the way up to Mérida, to Yucatán. And so then we see how these axes that are articulating these projects, how they're coming together with these mega projects that at this moment, well, they're creating. And so this, I don't know if truly when we talk about like what we think about like the PEMEX as a CNI, we haven't done that evaluation, because also this theme of the pandemic, we also haven't been able to have a lot of meetings and to take a position in respect to these points. This is an evaluation that I'm doing now myself, from my point of view, from what we're analyzing here, and not just here, obviously, but like analyzing how it's going to affect, how this free trade agreement is going to clamp up the control of the United States, by the United States, of the Istmo de Tehuantepec, this corridor, this interoceanic corridor. The United States is going to be who decides who sells or not their commodities, what commodities are received here. All of the gas that comes from the United States, also the corporations from the United States that are going to work here are going to have control, and also, of course, military control. And so then that's a bit about the theme of the free trade agreement, the T-MEC, the USMCA, together with the mega projects. And so on the theme of solidarity within and outside Mexico, what we're doing is putting forward is effectively, if the companies want to globalize in order to exploit us, to be in our territories, well then, yeah, it's important to be able to weave these networks, these links, to be able to join up with each other throughout the world, because this struggle that we're in right now here is not an isolated struggle. It's not a struggle that is just benefits us here in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, here in Mexico, here in Xochimilco. It's not a struggle that is just for us. At this moment, the crisis is a civilizational crisis, an economic crisis, an environmental crisis. It's important that we see that the preservation of life and of nature is in the hands, well, of everybody, and that all of us have to put forward our work, have to contribute our thinking, our hearts in this struggle. This struggle is to defend life, and I think that what we could do, all of us, from our own spaces, is to go to that level, transform, take down, construct, reconstruct, and also the other level is to articulate with each other, learning from each other, learning about what helped me, and teaching about what helped me and what didn't help me, in order to be able to advance a little bit more and to not repeat some mistakes that sometimes we have. It's important. I think that right now, the struggle, it's not even of solidarity. Right now, the struggle is of everybody, because right now we're in a moment. What's in play is life, and it's life of everybody.
Somos como el último espacio o el último quizás obstáculo, porque nos hemos negado a dejar todo, ¿no? A dejar la tierra, a dejar de producir, a dejar nuestras costumbres, nuestra identidad, nuestra lengua, a dejar todo eso en aras de lo que el sistema nos ofrece, que es el tema de esta modernidad también que ha dejado a deber a todo el mundo, ¿no? Porque el tema de que te modernices no quiere decir de que tu vida, ¿no? Sino para mal. Hay ejemplos de cómo la modernidad también.
So the thing that to modernize yourself doesn't mean that your life is going to the worst, but rather that modernity itself has also brought a lot of damage. So we as peoples who have been able to maintain ourselves, irregardless of whether people try to step over us, we have been able to conserve ourselves and live our dreams or our hopes as a people. And we believe people no longer have that all live in the city, that don't know how to produce. We don't know that they live in a very individualistic way, a non-collective way, that where there is no support or solidarity. We think that these folks lose themselves very easily. And so it's not just about solidarity with us, but for the salvation of all, for salvation of life, for the salvation of this Mother Earth, which is very damaged. And is even telling us, like, go away, go away. And so this moment is a defensive moment in which we need to defend life, because we need to defend not just our own life, the lives of others, but our families and our relatives, our communities.
Eso es lo que el llamado pues que yo hago desde aquí, ¿no? De que este megaproyecto del Istmo, el megaproyecto de la península.
So that is the call that we make from here, from our place. Again,
no son proyectos aislados, son proyectos con un solo fin: el dominarnos, el utilizar nuestros bienes naturales, el desaparecernos, el seguir lastimando a la madre tierra, ¿no?
It's a specific end, which is that of continuing to extract from Mother Earth and enrich oneself at the cost of everyone, of all our, everyone's lives, of the fauna, of the flowers, of the trees, and at the cost of all of us alive on this planet, at the cost of all persons.
Compañera Bettina, gracias por tus
So, thank you.
palabras que yo creo nos dejan a todos reflexionando de cuando ustedes hablan y que fue desde la campaña de Marichuy de que la lucha es por la vida.
Well, thank you, Bettina, for your words and what you share. I think that you make us all reflect to recognize what it means to talk about the life is, the struggle is for life, for the life of everyone. It's not just about solidarity. And thinking about this unity of struggles and the struggle for life is what we all need to be thinking about. And so for us in the U.S., the theme of immigration and borders is important because many of us are migrants. And so many of us have been struggling for years against the politics of death and immigration. And so you mentioned the impact that the Trans-Isthmic Corridor project would have, and not only in terms of the people in the Isthmus, but displacement and further migration. So it's important to recognize that Trump's border wall will not only be the actual U.S.-Mexico border, but that rather all of Mexico is turning into Trump's border wall, especially in the south of the country. And in that way, we also, how we've been living here in the U.S. And the north of Mexico, working the maquilas, that now there's also this transformation of and taking away of the territories and the need, therefore, to struggle for life.
Carlos es miembro de la Comisión Nacional del Congreso Nacional
So now we will be
del que ha
hearing the
sido
word of
parte en
Carlos
clave
González.
desde su
In the
fundación
following
en
25 minutes, we'll be hearing
1996.
his experience
Carlos es nahua de la región que
within the
ahora es el estado de
CNI.
Jalisco y es
Carlos is
abogado
a member
especialista en
of
derecho agrario.
the
A
CNI,
través de los años de su carrera
in
y
which
de
he
su
has been a
participación en el
key
CNI,
part
ha
of the
acompañado,
governing
asesorado y
council.
representado
He is a
a
lawyer
diversas
in the state of
comunidades en la defensa y
Jalisco on
recuperación de sus tierras.
territorial matters.
Un
In
ejemplo
the
de
course of
esto
his
es
career
Santa
and
María
his time
Oscura,
in the CNI,
población nahua en el
he has
estado de
spent
Yucatán,
his time
que en
representing a lot
2009,
of
después de
diverse
una larga lucha
communities
de
in their
años,
struggles for their
recuperó
land.
sus tierras de propiedad
One
comunal
example
ilegalmente
is
ocupadas
in
por pequeños propietarios. La
Mario
lucha se dio
Stula,
por 3 vías, la
where
legal,
in
la política
a
y con
struggle
la
after
organización de la
several in the
comunidad.
comunidad
Y ahí
of
estaba Carlos
Stula,
González,
in a struggle over
apoyando
several
en lo
years,
jurídico, pero también en lo
they were
organizativo. La lucha
able to
sigue en lo
take
que es
on the struggle in
ahora los
3
pobladores le
routes:
llaman ahora
legal struggle,
Xayacala.
the everyday
La lucha
struggle,
sigue
and the
porque ahí hay un
community
gran
struggle.
proyecto
And
minero,
he
y
was
no
there
solamente
helping
eso,
both in the
sino que también
juridical, but
la
also in the
intromisión del crimen
political.
organizado es muy fuerte, y
And
sobre todo pues apoyando, ya
the
vimos
struggle
a la
continues
mina.
there
Pues ahí está
in
la
this
comunidad
struggle against
luchando,
not only
y
mining
Carlos pues sigue
companies, but
participando
also
de esta
now
lucha y de muchas
with
otras
organized crime.
luchas a lo largo del
And
país.
so
Pues
he's
damos la
there
bienvenida a Carlos González.
supporting the
Buenas tardes,
community who's in
Carlos,
struggle,
adelante.
and Carlos keeps supporting
Muy buenas
both the
tardes.
struggle and many others
Muchas
across the
gracias
country.
por la
So we
invitación.
welcome Carlos González.
Vamos a tratar de
Good
dar
evening.
respuesta a las
Thank you for the
cuestiones que nos
invitation.
proponen tratar, procurando
We're going to
no
try
ser
to
redundantes, ¿verdad? En lo que ya
give some
comentó
answers to
Bettina.
the
El
questions
Congreso
that you
Nacional
have proposed
Indígena
for us to deal with here,
no es una organización,
trying not to
es un
be
espacio
too redundant
en
with
el
what
que
Bettina has already
participan
addressed.
los
The
pueblos
National Indigenous
indígenas que así lo
Congress
quieren hacer
is
a
not
través de
a
sus
organization,
delegados y
it is
sus
a space
delegadas.
in which
Decimos
the indigenous
que
peoples
cuando
of
el CNI está
Mexico who
reunido
care
esa
to
asamblea
participate
y cuando no está
through their
reunido es
own
rey.
delegates.
Esa es la
We say
esencia y
that
el
when the
funcionamiento
CNI is
del
gathered
CNI
together
en su
in its
parte
assembly,
organizativa.
when it's gathered together,
El
it's an
CNI
assembly, and when it
en
is
su
not, it
inicio
is a
se
network.
propuso dos tareas
That
fundamentales.
is
La
how
primera,
the
la
CNI
reconstitución
functions
integral
at the
de los
organizational
pueblos, en
level.
sus territorios, en sus
In the beginning, the
gobiernos,
CNI
en su
proposed
cultura,
two
en
main
todos los
tasks. The
aspectos
first,
de su vida
the
cotidiana.
integral
La segunda,
reconstitution of the
generar,
peoples, the
construir
territories, the everyday practices of their everyday lives, and in secondary to create a reform in the Mexican state that would allow for the recognition of the indigenous peoples in the Mexican nation. In a few moments, I'll explain what has happened with this, but first I'd like to point out that from our point of view, and even when the CNI does not represent all the indigenous peoples of Mexico, nevertheless, it is a space in which the regional peoples have managed to gain the highest level of unity and voice at an organization at the national level. Shortly before the rise of the CNI, up until the before the uprising of the Zapatistas, and even before the 500 years of this conquest and European invasion of our peoples, our territories, the indigenous movement in Mexico, even though it has always existed, even though, even as resistance has always been strong, permanent, as a movement, nevertheless, there has been a whole evolution. After the Mexican Revolution, and having been defeated, the Zapatista struggle of the revolution in the 1930s and 40s, there emerges a current tendency within academia and within the government that had a form of impulse by Lázaro Cárdenas that we called indigenismo. And from this came several policies that were considered indigenista policies, which had an important moment in the 1950s and 60s through a Congress in Pascual. And what is it that was being postulated there by these indigenistas from academia, like Carlos Aguirre Beltrán and other anthropologists and historians, and from the government, from Cárdenas, Aguirre Beltrán himself as well, and Alfonso Caso, who was the founder of this indigenista movement in 1948. The indigenous politics and policies put forth the necessity of the indigenous peoples to be integrated into the broader national culture. So they did not escape a liberal logic that emerged in the 19th century of suppressing and eliminating cultures in order to create a homogeneous culture, a homogeneous nation of citizens of the nation, which is to say that in the liberal perspective has permeated the Mexican state since 1820, and even from the indigenous perspective, even according to these two logics, the indigenous people had to disappear. So specifically, Aguirre Beltrán would articulate that indigenous communities were in spaces of refuge, completely isolated from spaces of capital, and had to be integrated in some way into the broader systems of transportation and communication and economic structure, capitalist economic structure, and that they had to be assimilated into the capitalist economic structure that dominates the country. In order to turn themselves, as Aguirre Beltrán would say in his own Marxism, his interpretation of such, interpretation of the elites in power, in order to turn the populations from the original communities
académica y de
into
política pública.
proletarians.
En 1948 se forma el Instituto Nacional Indigenista.
Through this
con ese
base of
propósito.
academic
Es decir,
and
el
public
indigenismo es
policy,
contrario
in
a nuestros
1944, we
pueblos
have the
y a su
creation
ruta, su
of the
lucha de
National
resistencia
Indigenista
y de
Institute
pervivencia.
with this
En
purpose. In other words,
1973,
that
dentro de
logic
esta
of
lógica
indigenismo is
indigenista, se va a
counter to
realizar
our
el Congreso de
struggles,
Paz.
our
Y
survival.
en 1974 el Congreso
In 1948,
en
through
San
this
Cristóbal de
logic
las Casas.
of
Esos dos
indigenista
congresos tienen una
politics,
particularidad,
we have
una
the
cuestión
Pascuaro Congress,
importante.
and at that
No
gathering,
únicamente se convocó académicos
there's
o a
also a gathering in San
funcionarios
Cristobal de las
públicos. Se
Casas,
convocó
which
a
has very
integrantes de los
particular
pueblos indígenas.
dynamics. Not only
Ahí
was it a gathering
participaron
of
compañeros
academics
que son
and
históricos para la lucha
government,
indígena.
but
Aquiles
also
Vargas, que fue
members
representante
of
comunal de Milpa
indigenous
Alta. Pedro de Aro,
communities.
que también fue
There
representante
was
comunal y comisariado
participation
de
by
con Aguascalientes.
leaders that were important to a struggle, like Aquiles
O don Juan Chávez, que fue
Vargas
comisariado en Urío,
and
que
others who
recuperó
were
tierras,
involved
que
in
tiene un lugar
Ahuatlán,
muy
in
importante en la
Jalisco,
formación del Congreso
Don Juan
Nacional.
Chávez, who was a commissionary
De estos congresos va a
who
surgir
helped
una
recover
corriente,
land
va a surgir
and
una
had an important
corriente
role in the
que
creation of
va a
this National
confrontarse
Indigenous Congress.
y que va a estar en
Out
desacuerdo
of this
con las
Congress
políticas
emerged this
indigenistas
tendency
y finalmente con
that
la conformación del Consejo Nacional de
encountered
Pueblos Indígenas
and
que
ultimately
impulsa
ended
Echeverría
in
en el año de
disagreement with the
1975.
indigenous politics
En
and
este proceso de
ultimately
ruptura
with the
se
Congress
forma la
of
Coordinadora Nacional de
Indigenous
Pueblos
peoples that
Indígenas
President
y se
Echeverría
conforma
tried
también
to
en
push in
1977
1975.
la AMPIVAC,
In
que era una
this
asociación
process
nacional
of
de
rupture, we get the
profesionistas indígenas.
Association of
Estos van a ser
Indigenous
los
Professionals
comienzos
and
de un
also
planteamiento
the
de movimiento
Antivat, which
indígena
was
nacional
a collection of
apartado,
indigenous professionals, and
separado de las
these would
políticas
be the
indigenistas
beginnings of a national
independiente
indigenous
del
movement
Estado.
of
En los 80s,
separate from the
diversas
indigenista
organizaciones campesinas,
politics and
particularmente la
independent
Coordinadora
from the
Nacional
state.
Plan de Ayala
In the
y
80s,
el Frente Independiente de Pueblos
a
Indígenas
number of diverse
van a empezar a
organizations,
plantear
including the
de una manera
Plan de Ayala
específica
and the Frente de
los
Pueblos Indígenas,
planteamientos, las
begin to
demandas,
put
las
forth
exigencias de las
in a
comunidades, de
very
los pueblos
specific
originarios,
way
hasta finales de los
the
70s, y ahora nos vamos a la
proposals,
izquierda.
demands, and exigencies of
Las
the
organizaciones
original
campesinas habían
people's
estado
communities until
dominadas
the
por
end
un
of the
esquema,
1970s, and
por
now
un
more on the
análisis
left.
que partiendo de la
Peasant
teoría
organizations,
marxista,
campesine organizations had been
no le
dominated
daba
by a
ninguna
scheme
importancia
and
a los pueblos
analysis
originarios. Hablaba en términos de clases,
that parted from
hablaba de
a
campesinos
Marxist analysis
y
that did
hablaba del
not
acceso a
give
la
much
tierra
importance to
en
original
el
peoples.
marco
They spoke only in terms
de
of
los
class, in terms of
procesos
peasants,
económicos. Ni
and
hablaba
spoke of access
mucho de
to the
pueblos
land,
indígenas,
but within the framework
ni le
of economic
preocupaban
processes.
los indígenas más
It
allá
did
de que eran
not speak much
campesinos
of
y que estaban en
indigenous
relaciones de
peoples,
explotación, y
nor
a la
were they
tierra
concerned at all
le daba
with indigenous peoples
un
beyond that of
significado
being
meramente
peasants
instrumental,
in relations of
como un pedazo de
exploitation
tierra
on
que
the
se iba a
land.
sembrar,
And the land
pero no
itself
lo veían
had a more
desde la
instrumental significance
perspectiva
as a piece of
indígena
land in which to
como la base, el
sow
territorio,
seeds, but not
como la
from the
base de
perspective,
la
indigenous
reproducción
perspective, in
espiritual,
terms of the land as
material
being
y
the base, as
cultural de
not
una
just a
comunidad.
piece of
Es
dirt
a
or
finales de los
soil,
70s
but rather as a basis and
y
foundation for the
en
production
los
and
80s que
reproduction
desde
of a
algunas organizaciones
spiritual
campesinas de izquierda
understanding of
se le empieza
relationship
a
to
dar
life.
importancia
This at the end of the
a la
70s and 80s,
especificidad de los planteamientos
from these
indígenas.
leftist peasant
Es así como llegamos a
organizations, only then
1992
do they begin
al
to
quinto
give
centenario
importance to the specificity of the indigenous proposals. It is in this way that we arrived to 1992 and the quincentennial in which we get a strong movement of indigenous and Black resistance that opposes categorically all the intents by the Spanish state and various Latin American countries, including Mexico, to try to celebrate and refine what is and bring good word to what is the largest genocide in the history of the world. At this moment of the quincentennial, we have been able to look at figures of a number of important figures who say that between 70 and 80 million people were killed during this process, and that almost ended with the entire population in the Americas in this process of conquest and invasion. 30 to 40 millions of African enslaved peoples that were brought here. Good majority of them who died along the way. And so the indigenous movement and many communities said it is not possible that we celebrate this quincentennial, what has been disgrace, massacres, murder, displacement for our peoples. Finally, we were able to, in a large degree, to no longer have that same sense of celebration. In fact, it used to be considered a holiday, paid holiday, October 12th, day of the race, seemed to stop being called as such, based on that struggle and that resistance. It is in this context that you have the Zapatista uprising on the 1st of January 1994. That uprising, as we all know, it helped visualize the existence of the pueblos in Mexico, the lack of rights, the lack of knowledge and marginalization in which indigenous peoples have lived within this country, the high indices of poverty, of malnutrition that have existed unjustly outside of the framework of the rights according to United Nations, just by virtue of being outside of the outside of the reach of rights, because one is not recognized or is excluded from political structures, political, cultural, social structures that are clearly discriminatory, and that is what makes possible and makes visible I believe we may have lost our compañero here.
Bueno, parece que tenemos ciertos problemas técnicos con el compañero Carlos. A veces la lluvia y a veces pues el internet.
Yes, sorry, we apologize. With some technical problems with the internet where Carlos is located. There's been some issues with internet there. And so fortunately, we lost them. We will be trying to reconnect with Carlos via phone. But up until now, he was recounting this very important history. I was locked in hearing this story he was telling us. And as he is sharing with us how this has been a question of 500 years, is nothing recent. But it seems like Carlos may be returning. We are waiting here if he's able to log back on or might be joining us by phone. And we have Carlos with us again. Okay, we're on a bit of a lag here between his feed to the Spanish to the English. Bueno, Carlos, sí. I can't even speak to him. He's on a different feed, but it looks like he's back on, and we'll continue here shortly.
¿En qué parte nos quedamos? Si me pudieran
so thank you, Carlos. Great to have you back. And he asked, where was I? El alzamiento.
Muy bien, entonces,
so he is getting situated, and we'll begin it again shortly.
Problemática aguda, extendida de los pueblos originarios de México.
So once the uprising happens in 94 and helps visualize the situation of the extreme situation of the original people in Mexico, it takes a government into a declaration of war in January 94, and eventually the government enters a truce with the Zapatistas and to supposedly begin the dialogues of San Andres up through 1996. These accords had been reached through consensus that were arrived at through consensus. It's important to point out between the federal government, the Chiapas state government, and representatives of the different parties of both Senate and Congress of both parties, with representatives of the ECLN through its own delegates and with representatives and delegates of indigenous peoples from throughout the world, academics, and centers of human rights linked to the issues of indigenous peoples. These are known as the San Andres Accords, as they were negotiated in San Andres Acanche, in the highlands of Chiapas. And what was proposed there in San Andres was the need to do a deeper form of the Mexican state, first to recognize the existence of indigenous peoples moving to the fabric of the nation, second to recognize collective territorial rights, and third to the right to autonomy.
En octubre de 1996, unos meses después de que habían sido
the National Indigenous Congress is formed in October of 1996.
Previamente ya se habían realizado
months after the approval of the San Andres Accords, and the CNI in this context at this point had already engaged in two major encounters that were antecedents to the CNI in San Cristóbal de la Casa and in Mexico City some months before. And the CNI, in this context of the Zapatista uprising, in the context of the reivindication of a series of demands on behalf of indigenous peoples and the construction of the San Andres Accords, the CNI is going to rise with those two initial proposals or principles. First, the recognition of indigenous people, and second, the reform to the state so that those rights, collective rights, may be recognized both in the Constitution and in the laws of the Mexican state. Specifically at that time, it was about putting forth the San Andres Accords into the Constitution. And so we say the CNI is going to have the first phase of struggle from its rise in October of 1996 through March of 2001, pushing for the integration of the San Andres Accords into the political constitution of Mexico. In 2001, we have a large march called the March, the Color of the Earth, that was headed by Zapatista commanders in order to be able to mobilize and pressure the Mexican state so that they would be incorporated into the San Andres Accords would be incorporated to the Constitution. There would be participation from delegates of the CNI and the ECLN, the Zapatista Army, in the Chamber of Congress, discussing the importance of why the courts should be included into the Constitution. However, a month later, April 28, the Chamber of Commerce instead approves a reform that went contrary to the spirit and in no way dealt with either of the 2 points or spirit of the San Andres Accords, dealing with recognition of collective territorial rights and rights to autonomy. After this, the CNI proposes the construction of autonomies with or the legal recognition. And in 2003, our Zapatistas relatives are going to constitute or create the Juntas de Buen Gobierno, the Assemblies of Good Government, without the recognition of the state. Through 2011, the CNI keeps meeting in assemblies. However, at that time, there was a war by the government of Calderon against indigenous people under the frame of a supposed or invented fictitious war against a fictitious war on drugs that was really a war on our peoples. That ends the third phase of the CNI, and we have a new phase propelled once again as in 96 by the Zapatista compas, who in 2012 proposed to us to reorganize the CNI, the National Indigenous Congress. And in 2013, we began a series of activities that result that happened at the Cátedra of Chavez, pushing forth the logic of the CNI that'll take us forward to what Bettina already spoke to, which is what occurred in 2016, the creation of the Indigenous Governing Council. And the proposal putting forth the compañera María de Jesús as a candidacy to the presidency, not because we believe in the politics of the state or electoral politics, but rather as to create a space that might generate fortitude, knowing for what was coming to us next. We say what is happening now, meaning that what is happening now, we already knew was coming. This environmental crisis, sanitary crisis, we didn't know when or how, but we knew it was coming. We knew this crisis was coming. This grand economic recession at a global level, we were clear that the steps that we're taking as a humanity now within this logic of capitalist reorganization is taking us to the destruction of the conditions for the possibility of life. And the Zapatista relatives have told us the storm is coming, it's there, and it's accelerating, it's coming to us. On the basis of this, the pandemic is now coming to us, and it's already here, and the elites are now new and refined And as a
nuevas formas de pensar y
consequence,
hacer las cosas.
the struggles of
La
our peoples
pandemia
also need to refine
nos ha
our
afectado
tactics,
de muchas
create new
formas. Ya lo dijo
pathways to
Bettina,
move
no quisiera
forward, new ways
yo
of
profundizar.
doing things.
Por
The
un lado, la parte
pandemic
económica ha
has
sido
affected
brutal.
us in a number of ways. Bettina has said, again, I don't
Cómo han
want to
golpeado a
go
nuestras
too deep
comunidades,
into that,
sobre todo a
but
las
the
comunidades que
economic
están
part has
en
been brutal.
centros urbanos grandes.
How our communities have been hit,
Les ha golpeado de un modo vigoroso. Y en los últimos
the
meses,
communities that are
no
in
ocurrió al
urban
principio, en los
centers,
últimos
large
meses, en
urban
las últimas
centers,
semanas, se han incrementado
they have been
muchísimo las
vigorously
muertes
hit by
en
this
nuestras
pandemic.
comunidades.
And in the last several months,
Por problemas
in the last several weeks, there has been an
de salud que tienen que ver
increment
con el
in
COVID.
the deaths in our
Y hemos
community
visto que extrañamente por otro
because
tipo
of
de
problems of health that have to do with COVID.
por otras causas también.
But
Pero
we
se ha
have also
incrementado mucho
seen,
la
strangely so, through different types
la mayor
of
parte de
apparently other
nuestra gente no quiere ir a
causes.
los hospitales. Hemos visto, y eso se
But
tiene que señalar,
the cost has
no
been
estamos
extensive. The
negando
majority
la
of our
enfermedad,
people
pero
does
hemos
not
visto
want to go to the
que muchas
hospitals,
personas que van a los
and that
hospitales
has
se
to be
mueren ahí.
pointed out. It's not that
Muchos
we
casos,
negate
quienes deciden no ir a los hospitales y
the
atenderse
pandemic is
en
happening,
sus casas, ya sea
but
con
rather that we
médicos o con
see
plantas,
that when our people go to the hospital,
logran
lots of people
sobrevivir
that go there.
a la
That's why a
enfermedad.
lot of people choose not to go there,
No
to try to
quisiera yo
defend
extenderme más
themselves,
en el punto.
and heal themselves in
Lo
their
que
own
sí
homes,
quisiera
be it
es,
with
tratando el tercer punto
local
que nos
plants,
propone,
medicines,
dejar bien
to
claro que
save
esta
themselves
pandemia
there rather than die in a
y todas las
hospital.
restricciones
What I
sanitarias
do want
que se han
to get to is
generado
the
con
third
motivo de
point,
ella han
which is
sido
to leave very clear that
el
this
pretexto
pandemic
ideal.
and all the sanitary
Dijo el
restrictions that have
presidente, le ha
been
caído como anillo al
created
dedo
as a result of
para
the
imponer los
pandemic
proyectos,
have been the ideal
los grandes
pretext,
megaproyectos,
according
sabiendo
to
que
the
no tenemos
president, who
ahorita
has
la
said it has
capacidad para
arrived
generar
like a
organización y
ring to a
movilización
finger,
colectiva
in
como
order
lo
to be
podíamos
able to
hacer
put
todavía
forth
hace
these mega projects,
lo han
given that
aprovechado.
we now
Y no solo eso,
do
mucho
no
más.
longer have the
Han impulsado todo
capacity
un
under these
conjunto,
current conditions to
específicamente el Ejecutivo
organize
Federal,
a resistance
un
to
conjunto
these
de
mega projects.
decretos
So they've taken advantage of that. So not
que
only this,
están
but they've
transformando la
also
realidad
put forth a
político-social del
whole
país.
set
Se emitió un decreto por el cual
rulings
se
that
saca a los
have been
militares hasta el
transforming the
2024
social and
a las
political
calles
reality
para
of the
atender
country,
cuestiones de
including, for
seguridad
example,
sin
an
atender
order,
a
an
los
executive
criterios
order
de
in
la
which
Comisión Interamericana de Derechos
military
Humanos,
are now allowed
ha
on the streets
obligado
until 2024 to tend to
a que tienen que ser
security
acatados
reasons
por todo el
without
país.
necessarily having
En
to
el
attend
caso de
to
que los
all
militares,
the Commission of
Ejército
Human Rights
Mexicano
and their
y Armada de
policies.
México
So they
participen
have
en
been, it has
tareas
been found
de
that
seguridad pública que están reservados
that they can act
Entonces,
on
hay
their
un
own
decreto
volition,
que
and it will
militariza
be absolved
absolutamente y al
of
100% a
crimes
este
and can
país,
instead work,
sin
be mobilized in
haber
civilian
considerado la opinión
ways to deal with
de la
civilian
sociedad civil,
or civil
sin haberse
society.
dado un proceso
So,
de consulta
so this has
y
happened without
finalmente estando la
considering
mayoría de
the opinion
nosotros y
of civil
nosotras
society, without any
desmovilizados.
process of consultation,
Y junto a
and
ese proceso de
finally,
militarización
having
se
the
inicia
majority of us
las
currently
obras
being
del
immobilized because of the
llamado Tren
pandemic.
Maya,
And so
del
this has led to
proyecto de corredor
militarization, alongside
transísmico
which
Bettina
have
Cruz,
come these mega projects,
Coatzacoalcos,
such as the Tren
y se
Maya,
empieza a dar una
such as on
reconversión
the
en la
Transismic
producción de energía
corridor, Salinas
eléctrica,
Cruz, Coatzacoalcos, as
también a través de un acuerdo
well as a
que no
reconversion in the
tiene,
production of
sí es una parte,
electric
pues,
energy,
el hecho de que las
also through an accord
compañías
that
productoras de electricidad abusaron y se montaron a la red eléctrica nacional
it's the fact
pagando
that
nada o pagando muy
these
poco, es
companies
cierto,
have been abusing
pero no es ese el
and
único
are
objetivo ni el
just
principal de ese acuerdo.
like
El principal es
are taking over the national energy grid,
profundizar
without paying anything. And that's not the issue. The main issue, the main disagreement is that we need to deepen, that they're trying to deepen the extraction and production, consumption of combustible fuels throughout Mexico. And we see this as something that's been pushed forward by the US, and that will express itself in the way of more gasoducts that will take the gas being produced through fracking in the south of Texas, will replicate that. And as such, we see this situation with extreme gravity. We see that there's a neoliberal discourse that is gaining more traction on the part of this so-called fourth transformation. The president says the neoliberal period has ended, but we say that's not true. We're entering a new phase of it: austerity, free market, that is expressed in a treaty much more aggressive than previous NAFTA, and that is the T-MEC, the U.S. Mexican, and that puts in danger our workers, the seeds, medicinal plants, puts into danger all these things, and is now in full effect in our country with the full support of this government. The large mega proyectos, such as the ones being put forth like Tren-Maya, the Morelos Integral Plan, the Transoceanic Salina Cruz Coatzacoalcos, and the new airport, international airport in the city of Mexico, that from my point of view are all part of one project, are benefiting the large groups of capital that for the last 30 years have been benefiting from neoliberalism. We're talking of Slim, Salinas Pliego, Larrea, Alberto Valle, and a whole set of transnational companies that are benefiting from these projects independently of whether they're going to work or not. And in second place, these large mega projects, as Bettina mentioned, not only transoceanic, are also pretending to be a new border to stop migration from Central America through Mexico, and instead concentrate them in the 19 cities that will conform the 19 stations of the Tren Maya, and in the industrial centers that will be part of the Istmos of Tehuantepec. And additionally, through these trains, these new highways, and these new corridors, industrial, urban, and for tourism, taking advantage of the cheap labor of those regions, as well as those that are migrating from Central America, while appropriating of the natural resources there, in order to transform them along these corridors as an endless market, as Bettina mentioned, through these trains and this corridor, they will be transported with new from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, and from the north, from the south to the north of the continent. And so this is all one project that is within the logic of a neoliberal capitalism, militarization of the country, obeys this same logic. And the new U.S.-Mexico-Canada treaty is both, what it does is both grow and make firm the dependence of our country on the United States. So we've seen this like also as Trump and López Obrador come together in coinciding in a migrant policy of a National Guard in order to put brakes on migration to the U.S. So we've seen acts of submission on the part of Mexico to the United States. In other words, it's important to recognize that Mexico has not been moving towards a different period outside of neoliberalism. It continues within that logic, and these projects, these mega projects, continue to favor in transnational capital, capitalists, functionaries from previous governance. They've tried to also try to supposedly eliminate corruption, but it's a simple and ultimately signifies that the politics of the actual government is a politics of continuity with previous politics and policies applied by previous presidents and administrations. And simply so, we must just look at the monetary policies that are being applied in previous governments to see how they continue to be implemented now. And in this current economic conjuncture, which is so difficult, the simple fact that the autonomy of the Mexican Bank be respected, and it's not being respected, shows how we're in a moment of subjection to U.S. and the question of, circulation of capital, the broader macroeconomy is being subjected to foreign interests. That is what we need to talk about.
La situación de los pueblos originarios en México y yo creo que hasta en el mundo, mucho mejor. No lo concretamos nada más en esto.
Thank you so much, Carlos. You've given us a really broad panorama that allows us to understand the situation of the native peoples in Mexico, and I think in this world, it's much better we don't. We didn't talk about everything that all of that implies, but of course, what you've made us see is how important it is to listen to this narrative against of the medical projects and how they work against indigenous peoples. So many of the media tells us that that the mega projects are for the people, but they're really for the corporations. They are death projects that take us over to the abyss as a civilization. Without a doubt, there isn't enough time to talk about all of this, the last 500 years of struggle, but also the resistance of the peoples of what is now called Mexico. The compañera Bettina and compañero Carlos have done an excellent job at giving us a general idea of what this means and what how dispossession has been accelerated with neoliberalism and with the poorly named projects of progress. Time is always the enemy of this type of conference, and in all of these interesting words, we're going to go directly over to the Q&A session. And so, compañero Mario, is going to moderate this session, and then we're going to hear from the compañera Bettina, Carlos, and Imwats, and then we'll come back.
Okay, well, we're going to question. The first question is for our compañera Bettina, but both can respond if you like. What has been advanced in the Isthmus corridor? Do we know what companies are doing the construction?
Bueno, aquí, pues ahora han tenido retrasos ellos. Por todos los medios han venido a tratar de empezar los trabajos. Sin embargo,
here,
pues sí han tenido
or right now,
por la misma,
they've had some slowdowns.
Por ejemplo, aquí en el Istmo,
but they've all come over here to push forward their projects, but they've been slowed down through the very way that these projects are taking place. For example, in the Isthmus, they've been, there's organized crime, there's wind farms, and there the corporations work in the construction of the wind farms. And right now, for example, I wanted to talk about the construction of the rompeolas, the wave breakers in Santa Cruz. And right now, there are 2 unions that are controlled by organized crime, and they're having some infighting, and they have done blockages throughout the region for these contracts because they want these contracts. And they themselves, for example, where they've wanted to push people away from the outlying areas, from the edges. There's people that live in the edges, and they're trying to remove them from there. Some they've been able to do that too, and others no. But those same companies, these unions, these organized unions, these criminal unions, they have been trying to dispossess the people there to push forward those works, and that they don't even need the police or the National Guard. They themselves do it. And so that's how these things are taking place. And well, there are some appeals in the Mijen zone, for example, and also in the communities that they have they've called people who are leading these projects to put forward a series of demands that have to be realized first. So in reality, well, they haven't been able to, in a material way, advance, but neither have we. Neither have we, and on the front, on the front of organizing, from the damages, from the impacts that these mega projects can bring to the peoples. A little bit, because at first there wasn't that very much information, and now another part because there's coronavirus, which makes it really difficult and really complicated to be able to go enter in the communities. And so that's something that they're using, the government is using. And so in terms of the contracts, where there have been many contracts to remodel the highways, and part of those contracts, they had tried, there's Hermes, this company called Hermes, this man from the state of Mexico who built his fortune above all on that, but also I think he's a criminal as well. And so a lot of like the way that these companies have been able to do it are outside of the country. I don't have the names right now, but the ones that I can remember
Bettina, ¿puedes prender tu cámara, por favor?
Is the son of Juan González, who is the Mexico City's chief of government.
Okay, the second question, directing it to Carlos, but in the same way, either of you can participate in response. After all the work that you have done, and thank you for sharing that with us, this is history of the CNI and the CIG. How has that been received by other pueblos, other peoples in Mexico? What is the perception of the CNI? Thank you. I believe that over the years, the CNI and Zapatismo, which is a fundamental part of that process, have had a very important impact in Mexico and its various struggles. Nevertheless, that since 2001, a significant part of the indigenous movement and of broader society have not really understood the route that we're proposing. What is the route? To construct autonomy, to construct self-governance, and to do it with or without the recognition, necessity of recognition of the state. A number of the societies that participate in the CNI just have not understood that, have not understand the importance of creating our own pathways with complete independence from the Mexican state. That, by the way, will never be the answer to the recognition of the rights of our peoples, because it includes, fundamental transformations, economic and culturally, fundamental differences. But in many sectors, there hasn't been that clear understanding. That is why the Zapatistas have insisted on the process of creating consciousness like this today. Thank you.
¿Cómo han tratado de enfrentar la mala información que sale del gobierno
So the next question, the following question is, how have you tried to confront the misinformation or bad information that it comes from the government in their communications?
Well, at first, we had some info sessions to have them to have this information come out, because there was also a problem of violence when it comes to the theme of women now in the domestic sphere. And so, well, however, that's really limited, and it's really limited because it doesn't reach the majority of people. It just only to people that have access to electronic means, to electronic media. But we also have some groups of communication, WhatsApp, for example. Sometimes we talk to them over the phone, and in some communities, we've continued to meet up when people still didn't believe that it existed, that the pandemic was real. We continued going to the communities. Right now, we're no longer going, just really just to visit or to leave some medicine to the compañeros. There is a proposal also that we do some workshops of natural medicine, but it gives us a little bit of fear because, well, we might spread the contagion. The theme of the sickness hasn't really arrived to them. And then the other problem that we see is that the hospital centers, the great majority, even though people die, even if people die of other reasons, they put down that they're dying of COVID. And so then what that does is it makes that the funeral parlors assume that it's COVID because they say it's COVID. So even if the death certificate says something else, the cause of death arrives to the funeral home and it says it's COVID. And so then they don't do any rituals, they don't do the vigil, they don't do all of these things that they do precisely like with the funeral package. And so that exists, and that's what Carlos was saying, is that people don't want to go to the hospital either. Now that people, I don't know, people no longer can breathe, but people have recovered effectively. People that we've taken medicine to, they have recovered, and being in their homes with the medicines that we've given to them, with teas, with family care, being there at home is a lot better than being in a hospital where sometimes the state makes things worse and people die. And so when people die in the hospitals, they say that they're killing people off. And so that is what's happening. And so all of the costs that this illness brings about with all of the families, it's all taken up by the families and they're without jobs.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and combine two questions that have come in that both are going directly in some way to everyone here, which is how can we support over here from the north, both in the struggle against the major projects, but also to directly support the peoples of the CNI. For example, with the sell of coffee that was previously done when we first started our sex-targeted network. So what can we do on this side to support you all?
Los dos pueden responder.
I want to start by responding, but I know maybe Bettina will want to say something too. I want Bettina to say some words. But I believe there's two ways to support us. The first is that everyone together, we all fight against capitalism, against the large transnational companies that are involved with these mega projects, many of which are located in the US. And that would be include the possibility from over here in the US to create a united front against these companies and against this government of Trump that is also pressuring the government of Mexico to implement a set of migratory policies that will also coincide with these projects. That are within their interests, both economic and geopolitical, above all the Trans-Eastmic Corridor project. And I think that's first and foremost, that together we confront this large monster that has its head in the United States. It's spread throughout everywhere in the globe, but the main part is here in the US. And the other way to support, I think, perhaps, is to support stimulating the economies of our communities. There's a number of different tasks, pending tasks that we're trying to push forth as a CNI to impulse or sort of propel the economies of our communities, including the stimulation of various products being produced by our communities, and you could support from there. Just a few weeks ago, the CNI had half a ton of coffee donated to the CNI by Compas in another region of Mexico, in the Sierra Nevada, and they wanted to support us and gave us this coffee in order for us to sell it, in order to be able to support ourselves that way financially. So there's ways in which we could do this type of work of stimulating these economies that would help. And Bettina will add some words.
It's almost the same. The communities have those who had been dedicated to producing textiles, clothes, other types of products, totopos, food. Well, they've been left without work. Because I'm telling you, the parties haven't been able to be put on, which was a big part of the economy here. And so there's a lot of things that maybe could be supported in order to support the compañeras and compañeros. We are also trying to do like a virtual store, but we can't get together with the compañeras. So we're trying to figure out how we can meet up in a way that's more virtual in order to form a cooperative where they can see what products can be moved. So that way, I think that way. And then the other is to continue denouncing and seeing and analyzing and searching for who are those pushing forward these mega projects, these companies in order to be able to denounce them and to put pressure on them in a way. And to do it through creativity that we all have, to be able to do it through the spaces that we're in. We have to continue creating autonomy and take oppression off of us from the system that's all around us, that's near us, it's nearest to us. We need to take that down.
So thank you. We're running a little bit low on time, and I'm going to turn the word back to the moderator.
Gracias, Carlos, Bettina, Imwat. Y pues yo creo que nunca vamos a terminar de agradecerles a la compañera Bettina y el compañero Carlos por compartir sus palabras con nosotros.
Thank you for moderating this part. Thank you, Carlos, Bettina, Imwat. And I think that we need to thank Bettina and Carlos for sharing their words with us. There's so much more that they can tell us, and we hope that we have another opportunity so that they can be back with us. Above all, because we know that the resistance of the people continues. All of the time we hear about actions that are taking place in more than anything, like in the South, that poorly named Maya train, and then the Trans-Isthmic corridor. We're also very grateful to the National Indigenous Congress for continuing these struggles, for being an inspiration that they give us for our different geographies can continue also struggling in what it is that we're fighting against. And thank you to everyone who logged on to watch this conference. We remind you that you can contact us on our website, sextagrietasdelnorte.org, and in the social networks, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And please stay tuned for our posts, and especially, like how Bettina and Carlos have commented, we're going to continue moving forward and promoting the movement of the products of the communities of the CNI, but not just that, but also continuing with the denunciations and the information and about what it is that they're doing. So here we are so grateful for joining us. Thank you so much.
Good night.